Most Linux users would say how great Linux is, why it is better than Windows and Mac. Linux gets a lot of praise, and it is seldom criticized. I am a full-time Linux user, and there is plenty of reasons why I like Linux. Yet, there is a number of reasons why I hate Linux. Let's talk about those reasons. Difficult to install. Despite all the improvements of the Linux installers, it is still difficult to install for new users. I will not go into all the details about partitioning, root user versus regular user, what is sudo, and other new concepts for a beginner Linux user. I will give examples from my recent experience. I had problem installing Ubuntu 21.04 and Ubuntu 22.04 on my MSI Prestige laptop. The boot process freezes after I see the group menu. A new Linux user would think this laptop is not compatible with Linux and probably give up. But I successfully installed KDE Neon, Arch Linux, OpenSUSE and several other Linux distros on this laptop. However, Ubuntu refused to boot from a USB. I figured out that the problem was in the bootable USB. Because I tested the ISO in the VirtualBox, it worked. I tested this USB with another Linux distro, it also worked. Then I tested different software to write this Ubuntu ISO into USB. I tried Startup Disk Creator, ZDD command, Etcher, and Alleluia! Ubuntu Live USB booted after I wrote the ISO with unet bootin. I was so frustrated, maybe it also resulted in a bit too negative reviews of the last Ubuntu releases. Later I also figured out that this boot freeze happens with Ubuntu only in the UEFI mode. If I switch to the legacy mode in my BIOS, Ubuntu Live USB boots regardless of how it is created. This brings a second problem with Linux installation. You need to change the default BIOS settings. First of all, you have to disable the secure boot in BIOS. Second, you may need to change the boot sequence to boot from a live USB. Third, in some cases, like the case I mentioned before, you may need to switch from UEFI to the legacy mode in your BIOS. I almost forgot, you also have to find out how to open the BIOS menu. I do frequent Linux installations and every time I Google what key to press to call the BIOS menu. On one of my computers it is the F2 key, on the other one it is escape or delete key. Show these things to anyone who wants to install Linux for the first time, they won't tell you, oh, that's easy. Hardware compatibility. The list of hardware supported by Linux has increased dramatically during the last decade. You can install Linux on almost any laptop or desktop and most things will work out of the box. However, there are still no Linux drivers for certain hardware. If your laptop has a fingerprint reader, most likely it doesn't work on Linux. For example, this is my experience with my Acer Swift laptop. In my MSI laptop, I have another problem. The microphone drivers do not work correctly. The noise is so bad that it is a problem not only for video recording, but even for video calls. Also, I use a Logitech MX Master mouse. It worked fine until my recent upgrade of KDE Neon. Now the wheel scrolling is ridiculously fast in some apps, and normal in other apps. Also, from your comments and emails, I see that getting a printer to work is also a frequent problem. Finally, proprietary drivers would usually work better than the open source ones, especially if you have an NVIDIA graphics card. But installing proprietary drivers may not be straightforward for new users. There is a workaround for most of these problems, but often finding a solution takes hours or even days in some cases. When I was young, I could afford to spend a whole weekend setting up my Linux. But now I have a lot of responsibilities and I cannot afford it anymore. So I have been using my mouse with broken wheel behavior for 3 months already, and I don't know when I will find time to fix it. Command line is inevitable. If you use some beginner-targeted distros, such as Ubuntu or Linux Mint, you can survive without touching a command line for some time. but eventually you will need to open the terminal and type some commands there. Memorizing and understanding these commands is not easy for new users. Even I, with my more than 10 years of Linux experience, often forget simple commands such as how to update the system, because the commands differ between distros. Ubuntu uses update and upgrade in their update command. KDE Neon uses refresh and update for the same task. I often switch between distros and mix up these things. There are even more complicated commands. I often have to consult my blog to find the command I need. I recommend you do the same. I also have published a series on how to use the Linux command line on my channel. To watch it, click on this card. Brilliant.org is a fantastic resource that I would like to recommend if you want to learn how to think like a scientist, statistician, data analyst, physicist, mathematician, or mechanical engineer. Brilliant is the best way to learn interactively. I recently tested myself by taking a course on logic. I can proudly say I almost always answered correctly, and in a few cases when I did a mistake, Brilliant corrected me with an explanation. There are thousands of interesting courses. You can start as a beginner with fundamentals, or dive right into the intermediate and advanced courses for professionals. Try everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days. Visit brilliant.org average Linux user or click the link in the description. The first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Limited software availability. Commercial software is rarely created for Linux. Most companies would create programs for Windows and Mac only. First, I believe some users would not mind paying for Microsoft Office or Adobe programs to have them on Linux, but there is no such option. Second, even if you use exclusively Linux software, there will be situations when you have to use Windows programs. For example, recently I had to fill in and submit some PDF forms, but they could not be filled in on Linux, because they were created for Adobe Reader only. I try to support free software, and I have been using exclusively Linux software at work and at home for over a decade now, but I still have to start Windows from time to time in my VirtualBox, for example, to fill in tax forms with Adobe Reader. Too many distros. There are over 600 active Linux distros. It's unbelievable, isn't it? First, it is difficult to decide which distro to start with. Second, after you have installed your first Linux distro, magic happens. Every new and even experienced Linux user gets that disease that is called distro hopping. You keep trying one Linux distro after another, and there is no end to it. For those of you who are new to this channel, I can say that right now KDE Neon is my favorite Linux distro. I reviewed it some time ago and explained why I like it and why I switched to KDE Neon from Arch Linux. But I still keep trying new Linux distros and review them on my channel. So subscribe if you would like to see my reviews of Linux distros and beyond. Too many desktops. There are 28 Linux desktop environments according to Google. I remember how I was jumping from GNOME 2 to KDE, then to XFCE. Then Linux Mint released the Cinema desktop. I had to try it too. When I saw a desktop with a tiling window manager, of course I wanted to try it. Every desktop has its pros and cons, and making a decision about what is the best is very hard. In addition, because of this fragmentation, the efforts of developers are dispersed across these desktops, and thus each of them has bugs and lacks some features that others have. I was an XFCE user for some years. KDE Plasma 5 is my favorite desktop at the moment, but it may change in the future. If you are a Linux user, you have to keep trying new Linux desktop environments. Program installation is fragmented. As you know by now, there are many Linux distros, many Linux desktop environments. Guess what? There are many Linux package managers. Some distros use dep or dep-pkg packages, others use RPM, or even more specific package managers like Pacman in Arch Linux. But this is not the end. Besides the main package manager, you can also use snap and flatpak programs. There are also executable files that you don't need to install. There are app image programs. Very rarely, but you may also need to compile a package from the source code. So if you are a new Linux user, you would need to spend quite some time to figure out all these different ways to install programs in Linux. I stick to the main package management system, which is Debian dpkg, and I try to avoid all other ways to install programs. However, I still use some snap packages and some app image programs. Pre-installed apps. Most Linux distros have a set of pre-installed programs. Maybe it's me, but I often disagree with the choice of these programs. Many of these programs are not the best in their category, and some of them are not necessary at all. For example, Linux Mint comes with Hypnotics, a program to watch TV, HexChat, Calendar, and a few other programs that I do not need. So I usually have to do some cleaning right after the installation. Nevertheless, Linux is getting better in this regard. More and more distros provide an option to make a minimal installation without all these pre-installed programs. Linux games. I do not play computer games, but I had to include gaming issues as a disadvantage of Linux because many of you do play games. From what I see online, Linux still has limited game selection when compared to Windows or even macOS. Some games that require specific software or hardware configuration may not run on Linux without significant tweaking and workarounds. Many game developers do not provide official support for Linux, which can lead to compatibility issues and suboptimal performance. As I mentioned earlier, graphic drivers for Linux can be limited, and thus your gaming experience will be worse than in Windows. Going back to the fragmentation problem of Linux, with so many different Linux distributions available, it can be difficult to ensure that games will run smoothly on all of them. So what is your experience with Linux games? Please share your experience in the comments below. Troubleshooting. If you use Linux, you need to Google a lot, and you need to know how to Google. Something will break at some point, and you need to learn how to read error messages and how to search for a solution. You also need to be prepared to try several different solutions until you find a working one. This can be annoying when you need something to work right now and you have no time to troubleshoot it. Despite all these problems, I love Linux and I think it's the best operating system. In my next video, I will highlight Linux advantages. Thank you for watching.